Hi, my name is Mike Dillard, and this is Self-Made Man, the podcast for men who want to leave their mark on the world and create a legacy of honor, integrity, and achievement in every aspect of their lives. I'm glad you're here, and once again, it is time to forge your destiny. So one of the most important ways that we learn as humans is through observation. We observe the actions and behaviors of others, and we model them. Well, what happens when an entire generation of children grow up without fathers to observe, to model, and to learn from? And then what happens when they have children? Well, you end up in a world filled with young men who don't know the difference between right or wrong, who don't know the meaning of honor or respect, who don't know how to treat a woman, and who don't know how to raise their children. So what's the solution? Well, the one thing that you and I can control right now today, the one thing that we can improve immediately is ourselves. We can be the change that we want to see in the world. We can become better men, better friends, better fathers, and better partners starting today so that we can provide a model of a man that is worth observing. Well, to help us do that, we are joined by Stephen Mansfield. He's a New York Times best-selling author and is a regular contributor to Fox News and CNN, and he is incredibly passionate about this topic. This is an amazing interview that's going to provide you with some fantastic ways that you can start to implement in your life today to become a better man. And ladies, while this episode is primarily for men, you are the ultimate beneficiary of the lessons provided. So I would encourage you to listen closely as well and to please share it with the men in your life that you care about most. With that being said, please help me welcome Stephen Mansfield. Hello and welcome back. Mike Dillard here, and today we're going to be having a pretty amazing discussion on the subject matter and the topic that really inspired the creation of this podcast, I believe 100 episodes ago, about a year and a half ago, with my new friend, Mr. Stephen Mansfield, who is the author of Mansfield's book of Manly Men, among others, which you heard about here previously in the intro. But I'm extremely excited to have you on the show here today, Stephen, to talk about the topic that led to the creation of this podcast a year and a half ago, which is how do we become better men in every category of our lives so that we can be the best that we can be and be better husbands, better fathers, better friends, and all of the above. So thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, it's a privilege. Thank you.
Absolutely. So I wanted to start by asking you how you got into this topic, enough to the point where you actually wrote a book about it. But where did this story begin for you?
Well, I had kind of a dramatic and semi-humorous beginning to all of this that really, like most experiences in our lives, culminated years of preparation and, sort of preface. I was in the Middle East. Where I was doesn't matter. And I ended up being stuck in a given city. And some Arab friends of mine decided to throw a bit of a party because they knew I was just stuck in that city. My papers didn't allow me to go further, and it was not the most pleasant experience of my life. So I found myself on the roof of a Middle Eastern city, and with a bunch of guys, for the most part, didn't speak a lot of English, and I speak no Arabic. And after a while, a guy who spoke a little bit more English finally turned to me, trying to make conversation, and said, "Do you have a son?" And I said, "I do." And he said, "What is his name?" And I said, "Jonathan." And he said, "Well, then you have a new name." And he announced this like he was announcing, the dawn of creation or the second coming. And I said, "What do you mean?" And a waiter who sort of spoke more English explained that in Arab culture, having a son is such an honorary thing. It's such an immense thing that they give the man, the father, a new honorary name. And it's Abu, which means father of in Arabic, and then a shortened version of the son's name. So this gentleman announced, "Your name is Abu John." Well, when he said this, that rooftop broke into absolute partying. They had been looking for some way to connect to me anyway, but they could tell that I had never been honored by Arabs, by my Arab friends, for being Abu John. We danced, they brought out food. It went on till 3 or 4 in the morning. It was wonderful, and it was all done basically wordlessly because we couldn't really talk to each other beyond what we'd already said. Well, the thing that's important about all this is the next morning, really, about 5, 6 in the morning, I'm sitting up in my hotel room, and I realize something's changed in me. Something's different. Something's feels more whole than it had been in my life. And I realized that this was the first time now, I was in my early 30s, and I had a son who was maybe 13 and a daughter who was maybe 8. It was the first time I had ever been welcomed to any phase of manhood. No group of men had ever in my entire life, and I don't have some, an underprivileged or neglected life. I had good parents, but never had I been welcomed to any phase of manhood, affirmed, given advice, celebrated, or given any kind of a name or an object to commemorate some rite of passage of manhood. And it profoundly affected me. When I came home, I began to look around and I realized, kind of the empty look that I see on male faces at the mall or on the streets. I realized that the average man is not being affirmed in manhood. There's not a lore being passed on to him. I had a war hero as a father who was a faithful father and in the home all my years of upbringing. And never did he sit me down and say, here's what a man does. And he was a man's man in one sense, but he was of a generation that did not know how to pass the lore of manhood on to the next generation. So here I was, early 30s, a wonderful family. I think I had 2 master's degrees by that point. I mean, in other words, I was experienced. I traveled the world, grown up around the world in the military, not neglected in any way, not underprivileged in any way. And yet I was standing there sort of naked as a man, in a sense, without any of the equipping, the armor, the wisdom, the lore, the input, the affirmation that ought to come to a man if he's going to be launched into his life to be an effective man. And that sent me on a search for the best books, the best teachers. Where is this lore? Where is it being taught? Who's got it? How do you affirm? How do you bring it up? I came to the conclusion that a lot of men in our generation are essentially waiting for Superman, in essence. We're waiting for that father mentor to show up and mentor us. I mean, there are entire movies about this, young unfathered men looking for that older man to step into the father role in their lives. And I realized, guys like you and I, we're probably about the same age. We're just going to have to turn to each other and help each other take hold of the lore of manhood and perfecting noble manhood, or what I call great manhood. So that was the real turning point in my life, and it set me on the search that led to the books and the conferences and the media appearances and all that I'm doing now, trying to encourage noble manhood in our times.
When you are in search of a solution, you first have to be clear on identifying the problem. And when I decided to start this podcast, the problem that I had identified is, much like you said, there are not a lot of role models these days, with 50 to 60% of households growing up without fathers. You don't have necessarily sports in all of the schools these days, or PE, so you don't have a coach as a figure as well that you can learn from, or a mentor. Teachers are not allowed to, specifically male teachers are not allowed to discipline kids in class anymore. All of the sources where a young man would learn these characteristics and traits have really disappeared. So when you look out at society today, specifically in the U.S. where we both are, what do you see? What concerns you most?
What concerns me most is if I say lack of fathering, I don't mean that in the narrow, in the home family kind of situation. I mean, in general, in our society, young men are not being fathered. There's an African proverb I learned years ago when I was in South Africa. In the villages, they say, if we do not initiate the boys, they will burn the village down. Mm. And I believe that's absolutely true. When I do a lot in the Middle East, relief work and what have you, and I've learned from some journalists who were held by ISIS that they said, the ISIS guys in ISIS are not, they're not just deeply committed Islamic radicals. They're just unfathered boys. They're untethered boys. And when one of these journalists got released and got returned to London, he said the guys in ISIS were contacting him on Facebook and telling them about their dates and stuff, as though they were buddies. And he'd been a captive for 18 months. They're just young. He said they're idiots, really. They're young street toughs who got captured by a cause and by some older men and by some father figures. And I think that's what's going on in the world today, whether you're talking about inner city gangs, you're talking about the 20% of women on college campuses who are sexually abused by males, you're talking about ISIS, whatever you're talking about regarding male misbehavior, male gangs, male groups, male violence. I think you have unfathered, untethered, unrooted, unmentored, uninitiated males, and they are amongst the greatest problems in the world today. At the same time, I have to say that I've had the joy of not only traveling the world, but also of sitting with young men on college campuses all over this country where I lecture and speak and so on. And almost every time late at night, over pizza and a beer, they'll start to say, man, what does it mean to be a man? I want to be a great man, but nobody's ever told me what to do. Tell me what to do. And it really comes out of a hunger and a desire to be real men. I even think that some of our fashions and styles, the kind of hipster logger look, these days, and tattoos and things like that. And sometimes when we don't know how to do it in our hearts, we do it with our bodies. We go male and masculine with our bodies rather than because we don't know quite how to do it in our hearts. And so, and in our character and in our minds. So the bad news is that the world is being devastated by unrooted, untethered, unfathered young men who have turned towards negative behavior. The good news is that there's a hunger amongst all of them to be noble men, to be mentored, to be in the ways of manhood as taught by older men. So that's a dual answer to your question, but that's what's gotten me into this, because I think we can make a difference in a relatively short period of time if we get after it.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the other pieces that I find extremely concerning as well is if you consider that your role models and who you're learning from and the extent to which you are impacted by them is directly proportional to the amount of time you spend around those sources as well. And you look at who fathers have been replaced by, which is essentially Facebook and the media,
yeah,
and what you're fed 100 times a day, depending upon the sources that are coming through your feed. Specifically very liberal media sources like, BuzzFeed or CNN or MSNBC or whatever it may be. Not only are you not supported as a male, but you're actually shamed. You're shamed for being a guy and for being masculine and for not doing X, Y, or Z or whatever it may be. And so you don't even have a role model there, but you're just being shamed for who you are and how you were born, which is insanity.
Well, and at the same time, though, Mike, I'm not defending that at all, but I do have to say that a lot of what is presented as manhood and masculine, you and I would consider to be negative. I would say that some of the reaction to males, some of the negative attitudes towards males, is because males have misbehaved so badly. I wrote Mansfield's book of Manly Men largely because I got ticked off. I got tired of looking on the television and seeing the idiot male, the idiot who's doing a happy dance because he found the remote control on the couch, and on the commercial, his family, his kids and wife are rolling their eyes. Oh, what an idiot. Every male is an idiot. Or he's shoving 20s into somebody's underwear at a bar on television. There's very, very few positive models. And so I got ticked off. I got tired of those images. So I guess what I'm saying is, on the one hand, I'm an outspoken champion for good, virtuous, noble manhood. On the other hand, I get why some people are ticked off. I hang with college professors, and then some of them are on campuses where 30% of all the females are sexually abused, and of course that's largely by males. So I'm not joining our critics. I'm just saying, hey, until we change what manhood is, I understand why some people are ticked off about it. And men, as you know, in our generation, sad to say, men are in decline by almost every measurable standard. And that's one of the reasons what you and I do is so important.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of nature and the will, if you will, and the fact that it works in waves. Typically, if you would think that we're at the bottom of a wave here in that trend, it has also caused a shift, which is why shows like this have popped up among many others, and you're starting to see this come back into the topic of conversation as a priority. So that is what I would love to dive into detail with you here today. Specifically pulling out the detailed aspects, either from your book or personal experiences that you haven't shared yet, on the specific ways the men specifically who are listening can become better men when it comes to their friends and their peers, better fathers, better relationship partners to their spouse, and also better examples to the young men who are around them, observing them, whether it's in a workplace environment, a neighborhood, a church, wherever it may be. But I learned from modeling. I learned by watching people that I observed, like my father, who was a fantastic dad and a great coach, and I learned how to be competitive from him and sportsmanship and playing fair and all of that good stuff. But what are some specifics that you can share with us today that we can use as something to model moving forward in our lives?
Well, I'll tell you, the thing I am most committed to, and the thing that I think that is at the heart of all of this, is correcting this dynamic. And then I'll give you the solution. Normally, when men decide they want to be better men, and they start to read good books about manhood, they start to watch video series, they go to conferences, whatever, they go to websites like yours, listen to podcasts like yours, they get the impression that they have to do all of this alone. And I am a huge believer in the idea that we need a band of brothers around us to join us in the great project of becoming noble men. I believe my academic field's history, my doctorate's in history, generations ago, men were naturally thrown together. They lived in communities for the most part. They lived in larger families, whether it was the village or the tribe, whatever have you. And so they had more intense relationships, and they were connected to each other. They knew each other. They corrected each other. The pack sort of was a natural correcting mechanism. The average man today lives alone. I don't mean he literally is unmarried and lives in a house alone. I mean he walks alone in life. And this is causing huge problems. Surveys show that the average man can't name a best friend. The average man doesn't know who he would call to get his son out of jail at 3 a.m. if the father was out of town on a business trip. The average man doesn't know who he would trust to go help his wife at 3 a.m. when something's gone wrong in the house and she's running around in her nightie, and of course the husband's out of town. What guy would he trust to go handle that situation? The average man doesn't know. In England, there's a plague of suicides among men over 50, and when we do the postmortems on those suicides, meaning that we look at their suicide notes and try to figure out why they killed themselves, loneliness is way at the top of the list. In fact, it would be the top 20 things on the list. So most men are relationally walking alone. They had friends in high school and college, maybe, or when they were younger. It was natural. They lived in the dorm, they were on teams. But as they got into their professional life, things got busted up. They got isolated. And so the main thing that I strongly urge with men as they listen to your podcast, for example, as they read my books or attend conferences or wherever they're getting their information about what it means to be a noble man, is that they begin to build a band of brothers around them who are not afraid of them, who love them, and they can help each other become noble men. I say that the goal of this band of brothers is to have a free fire zone where anything that needs to be said to make each other better is said. And of course, all of that is done in the context of having fun and hanging out and doing other things. It's the group of men you do life with. So the biggest mistake I've made in my life, and once I began to realize that I was, manhood deficient, so to speak, to coin a phrase, was that I tried to do it alone. And once I began to entrust my life, and others began to entrust themselves to me in a band of guys, 5-6 guys who began to work together on these things and have a lot of fun along the way, that's when things really began to change. And so if you're asking me for the number one thing that I have done in pursuit of noble manhood that's made the biggest difference and that every man listening can do, that's it right there. Begin to build a group of guys around you who are partners with you, so to speak, in this project of great manhood, and with whom you have a free fire zone.
And I just have to stress, be unbelievably picky about who you choose to bring into that peer group, because, ideally it has to be guys that you aspire to be more like and that inspire you. And, ultimately you guys are going to become the sum total of each other and your actions. And so, a gang is a version of that, right? It's just with very poorly chosen peers. So,
yeah, I believe very strongly that men are made for this kind of a band of brothers. But when they don't have it in the noble sense, they'll find it in the negative sense. You're absolutely right. Street gangs, ISIS, I could name 50 different versions of it. Criminal gangs of every kind. Even what you see on The Sopranos, for example, is basically a bunch of guys finding belonging and meaning in something negative. So, yeah, I couldn't agree with you more.
Are there any things that you have consciously implemented in the upbringing of your son and how you've raised him, things that you've either taught him or demonstrated like that you think would be really, really valuable?
Yeah, I tell you what, I think that once you begin to understand the value of manhood, the uniqueness of manhood, and the challenge of manhood, it's very important to talk to your son in terms of manhood. Let him know that you're mentoring him in the regards to manhood. For example, I've already explained that I had this big turning point that started in the Middle East around the time my son was 13. Well, I really began to pull in with him at that time, and I began to narrate the world in sort of manly terms. This is what a man does, son. Now, that's not what a man does. That's not how a man handles this. Son, do you see how this guy over here really made a mess of his life because he didn't stand up like a man and do so and so? In other words, I narrated the world through the lens of manhood. And Jonathan absorbed those truths and is a fine man to this day. We're both still learning and learning from each other. But we have a great relationship in that regard. And the reason was that I didn't just discipline him and deal with him as a father without reference to manhood. I narrated the world to him and spoke to him and, in a sense, called him out. In a sense, said, son, this is what a man is. I'm expecting that of you. I even apologized to him a few times. That wasn't really in keeping with the man I want to be. When I did that the other day, forgive me for that. And so that made a profound difference in his life. And I think it's something that it's an art that we have to learn to engage in. Most fathers don't engage their sons very meaningfully. And I think when they begin to understand that it's their job to inculcate manhood in the souls of their sons, they'll begin to talk to them in different terms. And I think then it becomes a joy for everybody.
You mentioned the rites of passage at the very beginning of the interview. Are there any milestones specifically where you've integrated that and done that with your son?
Yes. There have been a bunch of them. When he turned at the end of his 13th year, I had basically a Christian bar mitzvah. Those of you who know our Jewish friends have bar mitzvahs when their sons turn 13. They become, quote unquote, sons of the covenant. They have an initiation for them, in essence. I had a version of that. I gathered some of the finest men I know. We got in a room. There was food served. They spoke to Jonathan, talked to him about the lessons that they had learned about manhood, talked to him about what they saw in his life. I presented him with a sword. It was kind of a 13-year-old Christian bar mitzvah, and it had a profound impact with him and that or upon him, and that sword hangs on his wall to this day. The other thing that I did was I decided to take a trip with him, and and we just went to a state park and climbed the mountains and sat by the fire in a cabin and stuff like that. Along the way, we listened to a series of tapes by Dr. Dobson. Everybody, I'm sure, knows Dr. Dobson of Focus on the Family, the famous family psychologist. But these tapes were specifically for teaching a young man about sex. So we listened to them, and it was just the two of us, and we talked about sex, and he could ask any question he wanted to. Now, I don't mean to go too far here in the discussion now, but sex, how it works, masturbation, temptation, why do I respond that way? What do I do when I get hard in my pants at a certain, when I see a certain thing? He could, without shame, he could talk about anything. I'd answer all the questions. I was very relaxed about it. We'd listen to the next tape. And I had timed the distance of the trip to make sure that we could listen to the whole thing. And then we were at the state park. We just had fun. We just threw each other around the pool and ate too much and, climbed mountains. That was a profound moment. And the reason is that we have been able to continue having a discussion about sex to this day. He's not married. He wants to keep himself pure for marriage. But he's living in Washington, D.C., a lot of great looking women and a lot of, stuff going on in that city. And we are able to talk about all of it openly. And I can tell that he'll be able to talk to his son that way. So those two moments, now there were many others, but those two moments, I think, were profound turning points in our relationship, but also in the affirmation of manhood in his life.
That's awesome. Very cool. Same question, but when it comes to your relationship with your wife?
The main thing that I have done there is to realize, to put it in the language that I use in Mansfield's book of Manly Men, manly men tend their field. And that means more than just your relationship with your wife, as I explain in the book. But when it comes to my relationship with my wife, the main thing I do is take responsibility. I take responsibility. If I see my wife hurting in some area, I take responsibility to pull in with her, ask her about that, help her, encourage her, counsel her, pray with her, get help, whatever it is we need. If she's gaining weight, I say, hey, let's start walking together. We're both putting on some pounds. We don't want to do that. And she feels the teaming of it. If her job is too stressed or, whatever it is, and taking responsibility around the house. I mean, she has to beat me to things. If the light bulb goes out or somebody's got to get on a ladder, I take responsibility. She lives in a world in which her husband is taking responsibility. And one of the most interesting images that comes from the Bible, and I'm not trying to be preachy here, but when the book of Genesis describes Eve, accepting the forbidden fruit, from the Satan figure, the serpent, the Bible says that Adam was standing right there with her, but he didn't say anything. He didn't correct her. He didn't help her. He didn't drive Satan off. He didn't intervene. And it's almost like that's a, international mankind symbol for male neglect. Adam, as I often say humorously, was distracted by the football game on TV, and therefore he wasn't tending his wife. But the thing that I can tell that my wife appreciates the most, the thing I think that makes her feel the most secure, the most protected, the most cared for, and that really feeds our relationship is, yes, we have agreement and unity on all things, money, religion, sex, what have you. But the main thing is I am attentive. I am tending her. I'm on things. Somebody, I remember once a guy, some guy working at a grocery store said some things to her he shouldn't. Well, I called that grocery store. I talked to the manager. I got on that. If something's going wrong around our home, I take care of that. So men tending their field, being attentive to their wives, living with them according to a knowledge of who they are and how their souls are created and what their needs are. Most women would give anything if their husbands were tending them, so to speak. And I'm not saying I'm some kind of weird doting guy, nervously dancing around my wife trying to figure out what I should do next. I'm just saying I'm on it. That's all I'm saying. I'm on it. And that has been transforming of our relationship. And I'd have to say there's a difference between the husband I was, before that experience in the Middle East and the husband I am now. But it mainly has to do with taking responsibility and being attentive.
Very cool. Love it. Makes a lot of sense. Are there any daily practices or habits that you consciously pursue to help you become a better man each day?
Yes, there are. I make sure that I read or watch something every day that adds to my understanding of what manhood is. Now, I'm Christian, so I read the Bible every day. I pray every day, all those normal spiritual disciplines. But I'm saying beyond that, I read or watch something every day, a section of a book, a part of a video on YouTube from one of the main, teachers of manhood that I pay attention to, an article, a podcast. I make sure I do something every day to intensify who I am as a man. I make sure that I every day have some interaction with one of the guys who are in my band of brothers, check in with them, run our lives by each other. Of course, we plan to see each other soon, but I'm talking about every day there's some interaction, even if it's just text. How you doing? How you doing on that one thing we talked about? Great. I'm fine. Finding this area to be a battle. Appreciate you being with me in that. There's always some interaction with some member of my band of brothers every day. And then I'm always keeping a list of traits I'm trying to perfect a little bit more in my life. For example, even though I've described this wonderful relationship I have with my wife, there are things I don't understand about her. There are ways that I can behave. For example, one of my weaknesses is that when I'm listening to somebody intensely, I can look like I'm not really paying attention. I tend to look off. I tend to go into my head. I tend not to engage them, visually. So I can give the impression to my wife that I'm not listening when I'm actually intensely listening. Well, it's not going to be great for our relationship, if she's talking and she thinks I'm not listening when in fact I am. So I actually make myself look her right in the eye. I actually position my body so that she knows that I'm attentive to her. Those are practical things, but they're the kinds of things out of which a great marriage are made.
Awesome. So this has been a fantastic discussion. It's one that's been a long time coming, and I really appreciate the specifics that you've been able to share with everybody listening today on how you've implemented, really these value sets in every category of your life. And I wanted to ask you one last question, which hopefully we can be of service here. But what is your biggest challenge in life right now, in any category that we might be able to help you with someone here in the audience?
No, I appreciate that. My biggest challenge is that I am living an overly domesticated physical life. I'm very busy. People who check me out will know I write books. I'm on Fox and CNN all the time commenting. I travel and have a very extensive speaking schedule. Now, I work out and I'm in decent physical shape, but I'm not having enough controlled wildness. I'm not able to get on the racquetball court. I'm not able to go hike the mountains. I don't really have time to hunt, that kind of thing. So when I say overly domesticated, nobody's doing that to me, but my life is a lot about, Uber and planes and hotel rooms and conference rooms and stages and just television studios. And I'm not getting enough of the wild. I'm not getting enough, what we might humorously call controlled violence, racquetball court stuff, pickup basketball stuff. So that's the thing I'm missing. And I'm a young 58, but I just don't want to see my next, assuming I live a good long life, our generation is likely to live into the 90s. I don't want the next 30, 40 years to be without that in my life. So I'm somehow going to have to tame that, schedule that, get some guys to drag me out into the woods, kind of thing. That's a real lack in my life right now.
I can offer you some suggestions on that.
Please.
So one of the greatest adventures, or actually the greatest adventure I've ever undertaken in my life, was back in 2008, and it was racing in the Baja 1000. Wow. So that's not what I'm suggesting, because that's quite extreme. But there's a company that is kind of a arrive and drive outfitter that does these excursions in these 100-mile-an-hour, off-road custom buggies, if you will. And they used to just operate down in the Baja Peninsula of Mexico, which is one of the most magical places I've ever been in my life, if you have a chance to go down there and visit. But they are out of Nevada now, just outside of Las Vegas, and it's called 01 Odysseys. The word zero spelled out in the number 1. And I've since taken 10 trips with them since 2008. A lot of them just fun excursions for 2.5 days through the Nevada mountains with your friends, fully catered, fully guided with mechanics and first class. And you pull up in a little mining town in the middle of nowhere, at the end of the night, and they come out and pull down your window net, help you take off your helmet, and hand you an ice cold Corona type of an experience. So I would highly, highly recommend you look them up and schedule a 2-day tour, 2.5-day tour. Ask for Earl. He's the owner. The single best experience I've ever had adventure-wise. And in fact, I'm going again on another trip for my 40th birthday here in September. So if there's one thing I could do on the entire planet to celebrate that, it's one of these trips with my closest friends. So I think that would check that box for you in a really big way.
Man, that's tremendously helpful. 01 Odyssey. I'm gonna look them up right away.
Yeah, it's amazing. So, Stephen, thank you so much for the time today. Thank you for your leadership and your mentorship on this category. It is much needed. And where can people go to connect with you and to pick up a copy of your book?
Yes, StephenMansfield.tv is the website. Everything's there on a subsite called greatman.us. And, my books are all on Amazon and in bookstores and so on. But the two that the guys are going to most want is Mansfield's Book of Manly Men and then a little booklet called Building Your Band of Brothers. Mike, it's been great to be with you, buddy.
Awesome. Well, once again, thank you so much for your time. Thank you all for listening. If you found value in this episode, as much as I did, which was, I think, one of my favorites this year, please share it with those you know, and let's keep this trend moving. So thank you all, and we'll see you next week. Take care.